My name is Ben Burgis. I am the author of this book, Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, which is coming out from Zer0 Books at the end of May and should be available for pre-order considerably sooner than that, maybe the first week of April. But I don't want to talk about myself right now. I want to talk about this guy, Stefan Molyneux.
Not an argument. It's not an argument. It's not an argument.
Not an argument.
All you'd really be able to gather from that clip is that Stefan likes to identify things that are not arguments, which of course is a fun game. I can do that too. This computer isn't an argument. This coffee cup is not an argument. I'm not an argument. Stefan is not an argument. And gonna really blow your mind here, saying that something is not an argument is also not an argument. But this sort of strange tick that he has of calling things not an argument, notwithstanding, you might be saying, okay, who is Stefan Molyneux? What does he stand for? Well, here's Stefan not quite making an argument for white nationalism.
I go to Poland. What is it, 99% white? I don't need any security. The streets are incredibly clean. Crime is almost non-existent. Nobody gets called a racist. There's no talk of white privilege. No identity politics. No endless diversity nagging. You know, I've spoken against white nationalism, but I'm an empiricist. I'm an empiricist.
I obviously find the content of what he has to say there odious. One possible reason for my finding it odious would be that I really dislike empiricism, that I really prefer rationalists like Leibniz and Descartes to empiricists like Locke and Hume. Or, I could have another reason. But right now, I don't want to focus on Stefan's not quite argument for white nationalism. I want to focus on his views about logic. For all the things that me and Stefan do not have in common, this is something we have in common. We both like to talk a lot about logic. When I do it, I'm probably exhibiting the unfortunate tendency of people in many professions to bore people about what I do for work. I have a PhD in philosophy. My dissertation was on issues in the philosophy of logic, and I teach both symbolic logic and informal logic, critical reasoning kinds of classes for a living, among other classes. Stefan doesn't do it for a living in that sense. He doesn't have any sort of academic background in logic. He's a hobbyist, but that doesn't mean that he shouldn't talk a lot about logic. I'm all for that. I am a populist about logic. I wouldn't be doing these videos. I wouldn't have written this book if I didn't want to try to encourage large numbers of people in a non-academic setting to get better at making arguments for their positions and identifying logical fallacies, etc. I think that's actually really important. So I'm all in favor of Stefan talking about logic, or I would be if he had done his research. We'll get to that. Meanwhile, something else that Stefan and I have in common. We've both written our books with the word argument in the title. Mine is Give Them an Argument. His is called The Art of the Argument. Here's a difference between my book about arguments and Stefan's book about arguments. I actually know something about arguments. In Stefan's book about arguments, he messes up. In fact, he almost cleanly reverses the distinction between two really basic concepts, validity and soundness. So validity is about the conclusion of an argument following from the premises. Take this shop-worn example. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. You'll notice that if the two premises of that argument are true, if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then the conclusion, Socrates is mortal, must be true. It's logically impossible for those premises to be true while the conclusion is false, which is what valid means. But, of course, not all valid arguments are good arguments. Here's an example. Premise 1. Everyone who flirts with white nationalism is a werewolf. Premise 2. Stefan Molyneux flirts with white nationalism. Conclusion. Stefan Molyneux is a werewolf. This is a valid argument. In fact, it has exactly the same logical structure as the first one, the Socrates example, that in both cases you're saying all x's are y's, z is an x, therefore z is a y, and it's logically impossible for any argument with that form to have all true premises and a false conclusion. If it were true that everyone who flirts with white nationalism is a werewolf, and it were true, I know this one's really going to stretch your imagination, but roll with it. Try to imagine that it were true that Stefan Molyneux had flirted with white nationalism. Then it would have to be true, conclusion, that Stefan Molyneux is a werewolf. But of course, this is not a good argument. We should not believe this conclusion. We shouldn't expect to someday see a YouTube video of Stefan transforming into a wolf on the night of the full moon, because this is an unsound argument. So a sound argument is a valid argument, one where the conclusion logically follows from the premises, where the premises are actually true. That's the gold standard. Now, Stefan clearly didn't bother reading any logic textbooks before he wrote The Art of the Argument. He might have glanced at Merriam-Webster, which is of course not written by logicians, and gotten some definitions of a few terms from that, and maybe tried to recall some stuff he remembered Ayn Rand saying about logic, and maybe just improvised the rest of it, because he talks about validity as a property not of arguments, but of premises, and he says some muddled, confusing stuff about premises being valid, if they conform to our knowledge of the empirical world, and blah, 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 blah. If you can make any sense out of what he's saying, it's that he's saying that he's associating validity with otherwise good arguments where the premises are true, which of course is soundness, not validity. Now, you might be asking, why are you making such a big deal of this? Is this just like technical nitpicking? Well, it definitely tells you something about his profound unseriousness about the topic. This is a distinction, validity versus soundness, that I introduce, and every logic instructor that I know introduces on the first day of class. This would at least be the equivalent error of writing a book about statistics and messing up the distinction between correlation and causality. Not good. So, couldn't help myself. I was on Twitter, and I saw Stefan tweet something out about the glories of reasoning, as he is wont to do. And so I needled him a little bit about this. I said, that's kind of funny coming from somebody who famously messed up the distinction between validity and soundness in his book about arguments. That this doesn't seem to be somebody who cares enough about getting reasoning right to actually pay enough attention to the discipline that studies reasoning to just get basic concepts right. So I tweeted this out, and Stefan's immediate response within minutes was to do two things. First, he blocked me on Twitter because, of course, he loves ideas and wants, he really welcomes a vigorous exchange of ideas. And second, he, as a couple of people helpfully screenshotted for me, he subtweeted me immediately afterwards. Right after blocking me, he said, "I feel sorry for people who only criticize. They're like transitory tinnitus, easily ignored and soon totally forgotten. Also," get a little under his skin. He can't help keep on going, right? "Also, endless criticism only paralyzes them, not anyone with real ambition," right? Not like the Ubermenschen, like Stefan Molyneux with real ambition. "Armchair quarterbacks are almost always way out of shape." Now, I will grant him his last point that I am not somebody who has Olympic athlete level physique. More importantly, I have to say that Stefan's comments about me being out of shape are, what is the phrase I'm looking for?
Not an argument. It's not an argument. It's not an argument.
Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zer0 Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zer0 Books book club and help us to continue making online content from the left.